So the results are out, motivation is up, and we are all set to take up yet another interesting analysis of the current affair articles from The Hindu and Indian Express dated 17th of April. So let's get started. In the first one, we will understand what is the electronic voting machine and VVPAT audit controversy all about. Then we will understand and look into the issue of Naxalism in India. What are the causes, what are the problems faced, and what are the solutions to it. Then we will explore the entire case of Patanjali, which is going on in Supreme Court, and the regulations that it flouted. Then what are sovereign green bonds? Well, we will explain that as well. We will also read about the imported inflation and how it is going to affect India in near future as said by Asian Development Bank. And finally, keeping up with the prelims preparation, we will also take up the analysis of the very interesting and informative prelim snippet, extremely important for the upcoming prelims examination. So stay tuned. So a very important news that has been taking rounds of newspapers. So this is about the electronic voting machine and the VVPAT controversy. So what has happened? A petition was filed in the Supreme Court asking for full VVPAT verification, which means that the opposition parties, and in fact the petitioner is asking that there should be 100% verification of all the VVPATs which are in every polling booth of the entire constituencies of India. So how viable is that? That was assessed by Supreme Court, and Supreme Court has finally made a judgment that there is sanctity of EVM voting and we should adhere to EVM voting norms as well. We need not to shift to the previously taken up ballot reforms or the ballot kind of voting, which was horrendous as compared to the EVM machine. And so this context has been the driving force for us to take this analysis, which is very important for the upcoming prelims and mains examination. To understand the entire controversy, let's first explore the history of both EVM and VVPAT. So when the election is getting conducted in the largest democracy of the world, having more than 90 crore voters, that is conducted by EVM. But electronic voting machines are actually advancements of the 21st century. Before that, after independence, immediately after independence, we were taking up the ballot paper system in order to conduct voting in India. Of course, ballot papers had a lot of issue. There was issue of anonymity. There was a lot of booth capturing happening, a lot of duplication of the votes, in fact, manipulation of the votes, a lot of problems that eventually led to fall down of the integrity of the electoral process. To overcome this, the institution or the constitutional body which is the safeguard of election process in India, which is Election Commission of India, for the first time mooted the idea of having an electronic intervention into the voting system, electoral process in the year 1977. This was the first time it was mooted. Why? Because there were a lot of ballot paper challenges. Then it was invented for the first time by M.B. Hanifa. Now, this might not be asked in the UPSC examination, but this is a crucial information, more important for the state PCS. So, therefore, please remember who invented the EVM machine for the first time. Though not at a large scale, because at a large scale it was done by ECIL and it was done by the other public sector enterprises. So, it was first invented by Hanifa. Then it was first used officially in the by-election of the North Paravur Assembly constituency of a South Indian state, Kerala. So please remember, it was used for the first time in a by-election. Then, understanding the efficacy and the results that Election Commission got from this EVM use and this experiment, they were convinced that we need to put it in a full throttle approach across the entire election process of India. So therefore, they added section 61A in the Representation of Peoples Act 1951. Please remember, this is not Indian Constitution. Representations of People Act, which is responsible for controlling the entire regulations, responsible for carrying out election process in India. Now, when that happened, it finally got commissioned. It finally got commissioned in the year 1989 in India. So the first time when EVM was commissioned was 1989, and then subsequently after that, when the first Lok Sabha election happened in 2004, that is when the first use of EVM was used full throttle in across the India. So this was about the EVM. Now, how do you imagine an EVM? You must have exercised your votes. It comprises of two units which are connected to each other via a 5-meter wire. So This independent unit consists of two things. First of all, a balloting unit where you choose your candidate, and second one is the controlling unit. Controlling unit is not given access of everybody, so it is with the presiding officer, and the ballot unit is where the voting compartment is situated. And therefore, this is where an additional instrument called VVPAT was also introduced recently. So then what is VVPAT? As the name suggests, it is voter verifiable paper audit trail. This is basically to verify to the voter whether the vote that has been casted by him has been registered in, accuracy or not. So it is to verify that the vote was cast correctly. This idea was first proposed by Election Commission of India in 2010. It was first used in an election in India in September 2013, again on an experimental basis in the northeastern state of Nagaland. Then they wanted to use the EVM and the VVPAT together at a large scale. So for the first time they used it. For the first time it was proposed to be used in 2013. That is when the Mizoram Legislative Assembly. So when this Legislative Assembly election happened, that is when they both were integrated for the first time and used in a large scale. Then the first state is Goa to conduct assembly elections in 2017, and right after administering and analyzing the success of these experimental projects, the Election Commission of India was convinced that we can launch full throttle augmentation of EVM with the VVPAT. So this was done in 2019. So since 2019, we are seeing that our balloting unit is comprising of VVPAT along with EVM machines. Now, one thing that you need to remember in order to understand this entire controversy is how do you calculate and how does Election Commission verifies it? So first of all, what happened before? Only one polling station of an assembly constituency was counted. Only one polling station per constituency. But of course, this was not fair. This created a lot of biases. This was not representative of the population. So therefore, Supreme Court made a judgment in 2019 saying that at least 5% of the assembly seats, it should be increased to a number which is equal to 5% of the assembly seat of that individual state. So that many polling stations should be assessed. And not only that, it also said that about 5 PMs, about 5 electronic voting machines should be audited per constituency. So can you see the sample size that is used, which means it suggests me that even if I am filing my vote on every constituency, even after that, I will not be able to get audited. The reason because is only 5 EVMs per constituency will be taken up, and this is the major bone of contention. Then there is demand from the opposition since last 2-3 years that there should be 100% count of the VVPAT slip, because if you are just counting of 5 polling booths or only 5 EVMs are being counted in one constituency, then this also gives a huge discrepancy in the entire electoral process. So then why was there demand of enhanced verification? Because there was a lot of criticism from the side of the petitioners and also the political parties on how Election Commission was behaving towards VVPAT verification. So what happened? Various reports came across the different elections that held across multiple state legislative assemblies, for example Maharashtra, West Bengal, and they reported that there was due malfunctioning and also certain technical glitches and also in many cases manipulation observed in the cases of VVPAT. The voters registered, they themselves claim that the party for which they have voted is not, that same symbol is not getting reflected rightfully in the VVPAT slip that is coming in front of them. So the first thing is, even when there are a lot of discrepancies, there are a lot of issues that have been reported right in front of Election Commission of India, have they done anything about it? No. In fact, what happens with such kind of cases, it should follow the industrial model. In industrial model, especially in the manufacturing sector, whenever a batch of product is tested, even if one particular batch of one particular group is dismissed because of some faultiness or some errors in it, the entire batch is rejected. But during this time, it was seen from the side of Election Commission of India that they were rather negligent towards these reports which were coming regarding the malfunctioning of the VVPAT and the EVM. So can we say that this is reduced to being mere formality as compared to proper impartial audit that should be created by the Election Commission of India? That is the first reason why this demand uprose. Second was uniform sample size. Now look into this. You are telling me that in the entire constituency, irrespective of the size, irrespective of the population, irrespective of the electoral voting machines, I am just getting the audits or giving the audits of about 5 EVMs only. I'm just utilizing 5 EVMs only. How fair is that? Just imagine a constituency of UP. So one constituency has got, let's say, 10 EVMs. From these 10 EVMs, you are taking out 5 VVPAT worth audit, and that is fair enough. But what if the other constituency has got about 50 EVM? Then if you are about to take only 5 VVPAT audit, then this is very unrepresentative of the entire population. So this will have a lot of errors, and even if the errors are getting exposed, Election Commission is not revealing any standard operating procedure as to how to go about it, how to conduct the investigation. They are not being transparent about it. So these issues have been raised by the opposition. Second, there is hypergeometric distribution model. Imagine a country as diverse and broad as India. We have got very small states like some of the northeast states in Goa, and then we've got Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh. Now, even if such model of having such sample size of having just 5 EVMs per constituency is fairly representative for such smaller states. But is it even representative half the way for larger states like Madhya Pradesh and UP? The answer would be no, right? So therefore, this is a hypergeometric, hyper-eccentric distribution model, which means there are huge errors as to representation of the population again. Then there are technical malfunctions as well, because a lot of times, as I've already told you, there were malfunctions seen with regards to the balloting unit. The EVM and the VVPAT were not corresponding and coherent to each other. The results were not coherent and they have been flagged and ignored by ECI. So these are some of the criticisms that were raised, and therefore a petition was filed in the Supreme Court before the upcoming Lok Sabha election. Now, some of the debates that they demanded, this petitioner demanded, first of all, was that there should be 100% verification of the EVM votes. We don't want verification of just 5 EVMs, of just 5 VVPAT ballots. We want entire percent, in 100% verification. The second, they also went to the extent of demanding that we should go back to the ballot paper exercise that we used to do before. So they also suggested to return to ballot paper. How viable is this? That was assessed by Supreme Court. And they highlighted, Supreme Court of India highlighted following challenges with these demands. First of all, they said that this entire process is going to be extremely resource intensive. We have got so many constituencies. In those so many constituencies, a lot of people are voting. More than 90 crore people are voting at one given point of time. And therefore, you can see that it will become a very resource draining exercise for both the administrative personnel, for both the security personnel. It will also cost financial exchequer more. It will also cause a lot of time, a lot of labor will be required. So basically, the entire election process would get completed in somewhere about 1 year. Is it fair? So that is why Supreme Court has highlighted that this is going to be very resource intensive process. Second, because the petitioner highlighted that we should adopt it. Why? Because some of the European countries like Germany is adopting it. Is it fair to compare India, such magnanimous population, with that of Germany? So in a very light-hearted remark, the judge, Supreme Court judge, mentioned that this Germany model is good only for states like West Bengal because they have got equivalent population. So when we compare Germany with India, which is the largest democracy in the world because of the largest electoral population, it is not fair. So that was also dismissed. Second, it is going to have huge logistical challenges. To have installations of that many machines and then to get them transported, then to have balloting exercises, all of them will have a lot of logistical challenges, which means the resources, the people, the personnel, their labor, which could have been used in other productive works, will be drained entirely in just calculating the numbers of sheets. So there will be logistical challenges as well. Supreme Court judge has also highlighted that there are not errors in the machines intrinsically, but the error is in the human biases, because human wants to win the race, human wants to capture the booth, human wants to have malpractices, and therefore they take the use of the machine. So fault is not actually of the machine. These remarks have been made by Supreme Court. So then what is the way forward? What can we do about it? We understand that this is a grave issue. We need to enhance the sanctity of the EVM and the VVPAT model, but at the same time we need to ensure that it doesn't cost us too much. So what are the alternative proposals? See, the issue was that we are not being representative. How to be representative? Imagine a state of Madhya Pradesh. Okay. Now in a state of Madhya Pradesh, can we go plateau wise? Can we take up the plateau effect? Plateau effect, which means that the entire state of Madhya Pradesh is broadly divided into multiple physiographic divisions. The Malwa Plateau, the Baghelkhand, the Bundelkhand Plateau, etc., the Rewa Panna Plateau. So when we have got divisions in the term of physiography, why can't we utilize them? And why don't we calculate our auditing region-wise? This will help us to streamline the auditing without draining a lot of resources. Second thing is holding the Election Commission of India very, very firmly accountable towards any discrepancy if it's happening in the VVPAT. So they are answerable to the public, and they should establish a clear standard operating procedure as to how to go about the investigation and how to take the next step. Once they have discovered that some issues have occurred in VVPAT, they should not be ignorant of that. Next, we need to explore new technologies. New technologies and innovations are the solutions to every rising problems. The reason is we can always improve the efficacy, the security, and the scrutiny of the EVMs, which is extremely important because they are the linchpin to ensure that we are having free and fair elections in the world's largest democracy. So I hope this concept was clear. Our next topic is also the major headline of the day. This is about the Naxalism. The headline, as you can see, is that in the biggest strike at Bastar, 29 Maoists are shot dead. Now, you might ask that, ma'am, your heading is Naxalism and you have written Maoist. In fact, here it is also mentioned Maoist, and in some of the articles they are mentioning Naxalism. So, what is the difference and what is this concept all about? We'll explore first of all, understanding the relevance of the syllabus, threats to internal security, part of GS3. Now, first of all, let's break down all these concepts. If you want to understand Naxalism, first we would want to understand what is left-wing extremism. So this is a kind of ideology which is taken up by a segment of society where they are not in favor of the government regulations and policies. So somebody or some section of society which has got extremely different and antagonistic stances as compared to the current running government is known to have practicing left-wing extremism. So let's say that this broader circle is left-wing extremism. Among these chunks of society, some would even go to the extent of wanting to overthrow this government. So the people who want to overthrow this government are complying to the ideology of insurgency. You see, Northeast insurgency. So because they want to overthrow the current government, then some of them may also take up the arms, causing the armed rebellion. So in that cases, they are taking up militancy. So I hope these three concepts are clear to you. Now to go it more further, we will talk about Maoism because they are being called Maoist. So Maoism is an international philosophy, international ideology having certain revolutionary principle as to how to defeat a state or how to remove the current and exploitative state government using armed rebellions, using armed sources or revolutionary sources. Now, if you talk about this was initiated by Mao Zedong, who's also the founding father of the People's Republic of China. So it was set up by him. It is an internationally acclaimed revolutionary principle. And an offshoot or an Indian specific version of this Maoism is known as Naxalism. Now this word Naxalism is derived from the source of this revolt. When this entire group of philosophy started for the first time. It started for the first time in a Naxalbari district in West Bengal, where an agrarian revolt was happening and that converted into the anti-government revolt. This revolt was taken up by leaders like Charu Mazumdar and Kanu Sanyal, and they basically mobilized the landless peasants who were aggrieved, and they were mobilized against the landlords, the rich landlords, to forcibly take their land away. So this was a kind of first time when India saw a Maoist insurgency with armed rebellion, all of them together against the state. So therefore, because of the popularity of this movement, the entire wing of Maoism in India is named as the Naxalism. So therefore, we understand now, if we want to understand the entire definition, we obviously need to explore these singular definitions and I hope all these things are clear to you. The Mao philosophy is also clear to you, that the power flows through the barrel of the gun. He's very clear about it. You have to take up the arms, you have to be rebellious, only then you will be able to take power in your hand. And this is followed by some segments of Indian society who are popularly called as Naxalist, or also alternatively Maoist. What is the definition of Maoism then, or Naxalism then? It is a form of armed insurgency. Why? Because they are trying to overthrow the government while using the arms. So they are against the state, motivated by leftist or Maoist ideology, and therefore they are taking up the arms. They are following armed rebellions. So I hope you've understood this. Talking about India, it is prevalent in many states, but specifically in this tribal belt, in basically the southeastern states of India, like West Bengal, like you have Jharkhand, Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, etc. Some parts of them are also found in the Western Ghats. So generally, they take landscapes which are difficult terrains are taken up by them, like Western Ghats and Eastern Ghats, the forested areas like Dandakaranya, these are taken up by them. They are very, very well to do in the guerrilla warfare, and therefore they utilize such tactics in order to evade the government and launch attacks on them. So the affected areas are therefore known as the red corridors. So what are the red corridors? These are the Naxalism affected areas of India. Now, what are the root causes of Naxalism? Why did this ideology penetrated into Indian society? So, the main cause is basically a perceived sense of relative deprivation that is felt by the people in their areas. The main thing is about the arbitration and the confiscation of their intrinsic rights on land, on water, and on their forests, because these are forested tribes majorly. So, the main dispute is about the Jal, Jangal and Zameen encroachment by the officials, by the authorities in order to pursue developmental projects, and for which even the residents have not been consented for. The political factors includes the high kind of apathy that is coming from the political masters, from the government that is ruling them, because they are not sensitive towards the particular demand and needs of the marginalized sections of the society. It is often seen that the rich landlords in these areas are getting more richer, the poor is getting more poorer. This is enhancing the income gap divide. This is enhancing their perceived sense of impoverishment. Then economic factors. Economic factors includes the level of poverty that is ridden and that is driven in this area. So economic factors, because these are some of the most disadvantaged geographical pockets of India. They already don't have a lot of resources, don't have a lot of development. The income gap is also getting very high, which is rising the frustrations of our people. And then these economic factors also corresponds to their lack of basic facilities, because if a lot of poverty is dwelling in a society, then they will not be able to afford and get basic facilities like education, like the health services, like the sanitation, which is going to radicalize them more, which is going to make them more vulnerable towards these militant ideologies, correct? Then there is also governance deficit. Even if they have issue, if it is properly addressed by the collector, then they wouldn't be aggrieved anymore. But the problem is to reach out the collector, to get the right kind of sympathy and compassion and corrective actions from him. That also becomes little sad, because here a lot of bureaucratic red tapeism is followed up. In fact, a lot of nexuses between the administrators, politicians, and also the contractors, the illegal miners, all of that is said. So this frustrates the people more. And then there is social deficit. Now, if you are poverty ridden, your economic factors are not good, the developmental factors are not good, you don't have the basic facilities, and of course you will be somehow ostracized from the mainstream society, which is more developed. They are obviously cut off from the mainstream society. They are not that much educated. They also feel that a lot of loss of human dignity happens in their account. So these are some of the causes which leads to this perceived sense of impoverishment and deprivation in our tribal belts, and in specifically our red corridors. So, what government has been doing so far? Government has been taking good and promptive action so far. It all started with the 2015 national policy, which was a comprehensive policy to combat, first of all, the Naxalists. See, one thing you need to remember, that even if we understand and address the core causes with respect to Naxalism, it is also important to combat the militancy. Why? Because we need to also ensure the internal security of the state. That is the prima facie focus of government. So, first of all, government started a national policy in 2015, which was a multi-pronged approach. So government targeted few things. Multi-pronged approach. In this, government said that first of all, we need to combat the militants in order to secure the security of this area, also security of the other civilians who are not guilty of taking up these arms. Then second, we need to improve the developmental parameters in these areas so that the level of poverty, in fact, the level of human development enhances in such areas so that they do not feel this sense of impoverishment. And then we also need to provide them rehabilitation, because what happens in these tribal areas is their main concerns since historical times have been their forced displacement and not getting due compensation and not getting due rehabilitation. That is why they say that we want to revolt against you because you are not providing us basic human rights. You are evicting us from our own lands, devoiding us from our own community resources. These are the main problems. So then how can you combat it? At multiple levels. First is to combat the militancies. In order to do that, we have to modernize the police forces. We have to enhance the capacity of our armed forces, armed personnel and the police personnel. So government did this with the help of security related expenditure, where it provided a huge chunk of fund in order to enhance and cause a modernization of defense and police. Second, it created a unified command comprising of police forces across multiple corridor affected states, which is from Jharkhand, from Odisha, from West Bengal, Andhra Pradesh, etc. Then they also provide special trainings with the help of Operation Greyhound and Operation Green Hunt. So we understand this thing, that they are the Naxalists are very good in the guerrilla warfare technique. So we need to specifically train our personnel for the same. That is how we will be able to combat it more effectively. So therefore, Operation Greyhound, Operation Green Hunt. In fact, Greyhound was one of the biggest success in the Naxalist movement in Andhra Pradesh. It was launched in 1989. Amazing success. Seeing this success, it was more further launched in a similar kind of thing was launched across the India, across the Naxal states in the form of Operation Green Hunt. Then we have also got a multi-pronged strategy to become smart police or to create smart policing in India. This was done with the help of Samadhan strategy adopted by the government of India 2017. This was about combating, but what about the people over there? We have to provide them better development, better infrastructure. To begin with the infrastructure, at least lay down the road. So government started doing this with the help of road requirement plan scheme, where it wanted to connect all the red corridors with the mainstream land and across with each other. Then establishing mobile tower project in order to improve the connectivity. Then there was Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana. There was model school developments. A lot of Kendriya Vidyalaya schools were set up, and aspirational district program under which all of these left-wing extremist affected areas are included. So they will be developed and taken care of by a priority basis, on a priority basis with the help of ADP program. Then they should also be given certain entitlement and rehabilitation. So let's say we need to have a proper and more effective implementation of the most important regulation taking care of these things, which is the PESA Act, the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act of 1996. Ensuring all of this, we will ensure that our people who are living in these extremist areas, who are living in these radical areas, feel that they are getting equivalent human dignity, equivalent human right as compared to the mainstream India. Now, talking about the way forward, first of all, we understand that there is a huge nexus going on. The problem is that the Red Sanders miners or the poachers, they basically give some money, give some bribe to the government, to the politicians, to the administrators, so they never really stop them. This enhances the spirit of Naxalism because they are getting funded via political sources, via contractual sources, via administrative sources, and vice versa. This entire correlation has to be choked by choking the funding that is happening between them. Of course, we need a lot of technological solutions. We need to trace them properly. So that has to be taken care of. Second is we need to empower them on multiple levels. There should be financial inclusion, there should be financial empowerment, especially of the women, especially of the children, especially of the vulnerable sections. Then we need to give them proper and due forest right. A lot of forest right issues have been emerged from the Forest Rights Act. So that needs to be resolved. It needs to become more inclusive. Then infrastructure should also be developed so that they can get proper connectivity and economic growth can be propelled in their areas. Last but not the least, to each and every challenges going on today, we have got one or the other technological solution. So we need to have technological solutions in these regards also. We can have GPS for better tracing of such militant groups. We can also have GIS for better mapping so that we can have, we can devolve land rights and proper land rights. We can ensure that there is no encroachment happening, proper land rights are given duly. We also need to perform certain drones in order to have better combat capacity. Ensuring all of this, we will ensure peace, security and integrity in these very, very resourceful chunks of India. Moving on to the Patanjali case. Another important case taking rounds in Supreme Court is why? Because Baba Ramdev, who was facing contempt from the Supreme Court, and his associate have unconditionally apologized before the Supreme Court because this particular Patanjali firm has been lashed by Supreme Court due to violation of two things. We are going to study all of that. First of all, what is the case context? The petition that was filed against the Patanjali and their board of directors were about them launching some misleading advertisements all over the newspapers. Back in 2022, it was observed that Patanjali Wellness produced an ad talking about the misconception spread by allopathy. Allopathy, which is the most conventional and popularly source of curative medicine that we practice in India, they completely flouted and they completely denigrated the allopathic medicine. They called it stupid and bankrupt science. They attributed COVID-19 deaths because of allopathic medicine. Now, this is not backed by any report, not backed by any research. And still, they were flouting all these statements. Of course, a proactive action was taken up by the Indian Medical Association, who filed a complaint against the Patanjali. So, this case became Indian Medical Association versus Union of India case 2022. Now, please understand what happens. What are the legal arguments? So, whenever you put up any misleading argument or any false claim on your product, or whenever you try to give false argument about some other product which is tentatively or which is more likely to be productive or effective against any disease, in that case you are violating two primary laws of the country. First of all, and the very important, the Consumer Protection Act, because you are misleading the consumer. And second, which is primary focus of this case, is the Drugs and Other Magical Remedies Act of 1954, which basically stops anybody from giving misleading claims out to the public, claiming that they can have certain magical powers and by touching somebody they'll cure the ailments, or by giving certain medicines. They don't have any backing for it, they don't have any research backing for it, but they are just claiming these things. They are misleading people for this, and this was done by Patanjali since really long, because in an FSSAI report as well, Patanjali was caught to be cheating on more than 37 products. In fact, a lot of products that you can see right now, it was claimed by FSSAI that they were not compliant with the FSSAI standards only, let alone being healthy for the population. So that was put forward by this organization. And then why in particular this violation is done? Because under the Drugs and Other Magical Remedies Act, it is also said that you cannot mention or you cannot publicize or advertise the curative medicine or the curative powers from your brand to cure any disease which is mentioned as a scheduled disease under the Drugs and Other Magical Remedies Act. One such disease is diabetes. But Patanjali keeps on claiming that they cure diabetes and create a zero diabetic condition. They'll create a zero diabetic India. These are their claims. So this is why a case was put forward. And in order to analyze these two laws, we need to understand particular sections of them. First of all, the Consumer Protection Act, Section 2, Clause 8 of it says that it first of all defines what is misleading advertisement. First of all, misleading advertisement is any that advertisement which gives false description of the product. Or let's say it has said that it has got soya bean oil, but instead it uses dalda in it. It is saying that it is using paneer or cheese in it, rather it is using some synthetic milk product in it. So, giving false description of the product or services, partakes in unfair trade practices. Because when I'm creating such misleading advertisement, what I'm doing, I'm creating monopolization in the market. I'm trying to attract heavy traffic towards me, and that is my agenda. But that is an unfair market practice. That is also taken care as, or also considered as, a misleading act. Second one is deliberately conceals important information and mislead the consumer about the nature, substance, quantity and quality of the product or services. This particular organization has done it multiple times according to the reports. So Consumer Protection Act is the one who acknowledges the misleading act and gives stringent punishment under its section 89. It says that if you are doing it for the first time, you will be getting penalties up to 10 lakh rupees and imprisonment up to 2 years. And if you are doing subsequent violations, then these penalties will also increase. So the penalties will go over and above 50 lakhs and the imprisonment may extend to 5 years. Huge penalties are happening. But what is the primary legislation which governs that we are not fooled by any product that is created by any businessman? That is the Drugs and Other Magical Remedies Act. It does two purposes. Controls the advertisement of the drug. Second, it prohibits the claims of any kind, of anybody or any Baba pursuing any magical properties or any magical qualities to cure the ailments which have never been healed by anyone. So these two things are the basic objectives of the DOMA, that is Drugs and Other Magical Remedies Act. And under section 4, it says that there is an entire prohibition against publishing misleading advertisement defined in Consumer Protection Act. And in section 7, publishing a misleading act is punishable up to 6-month imprisonment or at least a fine for the first offense. But if you are doing a subsequent offense, then you can extract up to 1 year of imprisonment as well along with the fine. So obviously, this is about the Drugs and Other Magical Remedies Act. Now, there are two also very important things which you need to remember. First of all, what are the prohibited advertisements? Following is the list of the advertisements which are not at all prohibited in India. You can have a look. It is including miscarriages or preventing conception in women, correcting the menstrual disorders, curing diagnosis or preventing diseases or conditions included, which is in the included list or in the included schedule. It comprises of approximately 54 such diseases which are deemed by the Indian government as incurable as of now, and therefore they prohibit any company, any pharma company, to put up advertisements promising that they can cure it, because it is not possible. Which are these? There is typhoid, there is of course cancer, there is even obesity, there is even TB. So all of them and many more are considered. Epilepsy is there, so all of them are considered in this, included in this schedule. So you cannot make advertisements on them. But in the real time, have you observed that you can actually see advertisements on them? So which means the rules are getting flouted, which means the implementation of this rule is lagging. So therefore, there are huge criticisms as well. First of all, the law is rarely enforced. Patanjali was a huge company, was putting up a lot of advertisement, and therefore it was put forward, and that too after a petition getting filed in the Supreme Court. It was not taken in cognizance suo motu. Then what about the small companies which are putting such claims and putting such brands everywhere? So first of all, law is rarely enforced and the products are freely available. Both you and me know about this. Second, law is considered outdated. They have included 54, but as of current situation, this is an outdated law. The outdated law is basically, this law was made in 1954. Science has evolved, technologies have evolved, and eventually we have actually led to curation of about 14 diseases. Second thing is, see, the Ayush, or the Ayurvedic, these traditional medicines are basically a very important soft power for the India. And this is also something, these are the ancient traditional medicine system, which also represents the culture of the India. So somebody is doubting, somebody is raising question on the status of traditional medicine system, then this is going to have a larger impact on the uses of yoga and Ayurveda by the common people. So these are some of the criticisms. What can we do about it? First of all, ensure that there is at least strict prohibition and there is no exception at all regarding these provisions. So strict enforcement is the need of the hour. Second, public awareness is very important. Public should know. Before that, many of us, including me, we were not aware of these scheduled lists. We were not aware why Patanjali was flouting many rules. What is this misleading claim? What are these false claims? But now when we are aware, we'll be able to take more better decisions. So therefore, public awareness is the need of the hour against misleading and advertisement. Establish mechanisms to report and monitor the objectionable ad. It shouldn't come directly to the Supreme Court via any petition. There should be certain monitoring mechanisms as well. Then update the act, because we know that this is outdated. Many of them have already found curable and curative solutions, so they should be removed from it. And we also need to partner with the healthcare professionals. So healthcare professionals should be there, community involvement should be there, and government willingness should be there in order to provide a healthy India. And a healthy India will finally translate into a beautiful Viksit Bharat. So therefore, the idea is to promote responsible advertising by also ensuring that we provide healthcare for all. Now talking about the sovereign green bonds. So why is this in news? Because RBI has recently allowed the foreign institutional investors to invest in India's green project through what? This newly made mechanism, which is sovereign green bonds. You must have already heard about the sovereign gold bonds, and there are multiple other sovereign bonds. It is government security. But now we are going to talk about this recently launched sovereign green bond. So what is happening in the world right now? We all are aware of the climate change that is happening. So every country is taking efforts in order to fulfill their nationally determined contributions as they have promised in the Paris Agreement. Now, in order to pursue that, we need to ensure that our economy is becoming low carbon intensive. It is not emitting that much carbon. For that, we need to have better solutions. For that, we'll be needing research and development, technological solutions. For that, we will be needing development of certain infrastructures which are intrinsically environmental friendly and low carbon intensive. But in order to make such an overhaul in the entire infrastructure system, don't we require a lot of capital? So where will this capital come from? It shouldn't be just the burden of the government to take care of the climate compliances. It is responsibility of everyone. In order to follow up with that, government has proposed that we are launching government debt. We are launching certain securities in the name of sovereign green bond, which will be backed by our own securities. And these are the kind of debt that the government is trying to take from the people, and it is going to be used in projects which are attempting to accelerate India's transition to a low carbon economy. These are known as sovereign gold bonds. What is the demand? Demand is obviously, what is the benefit? Benefit is obviously it will enhance the amount of capital availability. The whole issue about transitioning to a lower carbon intensive economy is lack of finances. And this is main problem in the developing countries. So therefore, we need to attract finances. One good method would be to call up the foreign institutional investors for the same, who are also seemingly very interested, especially from the developed country, where they get benefited, they get tax benefits when they invest in certain green projects. So that is done. That is one of the benefits. Second is it supports India's climate ambitions. Our Panchamrit principle adopted in COP26 is that we should be having 50% of energy coming from the renewable sources. How many solar power and wind power projects should we need to make in order to reach this target? Without proper capital investment, it won't be done. So therefore, this is our first one. Then we want to reduce carbon intensity of the economy by over 45%, and we also aim to become a net zero country in 2070. These are our ambitious climate goals. It can be achieved with the help of sovereign green bonds. Then it also addresses the greenwashing concerns. I have already told you in the analyst dated 14th of April, in which we discussed what is greenwashing, where basically a company manipulates and capitalizes on the green consciousness, the climate consciousness that is growing across, and therefore they say that their product is environment friendly, it is climate friendly, but at the back side of it, at the flip side of it, it is actually not very environmental friendly. I've already given you a lot of examples. I've given you example of Volkswagen, the beauty industry, the textile industry. So you can also watch that one for better clarity. It addresses greenwashing because here government is responsible. So if the government performs greenwashing, then they are accountable for the other foreign institutional investors. So it addresses that concerns as well. Now, what are the green bonds in India? How did this start? So it started for the first time via our finance minister announcement during budget of 2022-23 to launch and to have the sovereign green bonds. Were they started immediately after? No. But what were the scheme? What is the scheme all about? What is their plan? They want to have 16,000 crore worth of investment, and that will be made available in two tranches, one in January and February. They will be maturing in about 5 to 10 years, and from which is 2028, 2023. They are classified as statutory liquidity ratio by the RBI, which means there are multiple type of ratios, multiple type of reserves that a bank has to maintain. One with the RBI, which is known as cash reserve ratio. Second, with itself, this is a form of liquid money, which is not very easily lendable to the people. It is not open for the customers as such. So therefore, this statutory liquidity ratio is established and maintained by the bank itself. Talking about the differences between CRR and SLR, which is more beneficial for the bank? Of course, the SLR, because when it maintains SLR, it is able to earn interest from them, unlike CRR, there is no interest on it. So it is classified as a statutory liquidity ratio. Now, I want to teach one more term, which is known as greenium. So greenium sounds somewhere similar to premium which somebody has to pay to get some services. This greenium or this kind of green premier is on the bank. Why? Because it has been observed that green sovereign bonds attracts lower yield or lower interest as compared to the other government securities. So of course, they are not going to give you a lot of returns. There is some cost benefit ratio. Of course, you're going for a good cost, but it's not going to be very economically profitable. So that is a kind of premium, that is a kind of leeway that is taken up by the banks. This is known as greenium. What is green taxonomy? Another term discussed over here. See, what issue happened over here is, so Sitharaman decided that we are going to launch a sovereign green bond, but after all, it is a responsibility of the RBI to put forward these bonds in public. So RBI was not ready to do that because RBI was not having the green taxonomy. So these are green taxonomy is basically a set of standards in order to make an assessment whether the investments are truly environmental or having certain emission credential or not. Government can tell me that I want to take the money for this particular project, but somebody need to do the audit as well. How do I measure the metric whether it is actually good with your emission credentials and it is environmental friendly? So in order to establish that, RBI was not having a taxonomy of its own, a set of standards to assess these projects on its own. So the project was taken up by the Finance Ministry. Finance Ministry said that we will be creating a framework, and this became India's first sovereign green bond framework, which ensured and which basically set up certain metrics on the basis of which you will be able to guess whether a particular project is really environmental friendly or not. So what is the need of the hour right now? The need of the hour, this is a very welcoming project. It will help us to transition and to fulfill our Panchamrit principles. But at the same time, we need to have a more dedicated and we need to have a more prudent approach for this. We need to identify the right projects, which means don't go for the hydroelectric projects. They are very intensive. But we can go for solar power projects, that too in the right space, in the right time, which are going to give us better outputs, which are going to have better, credible audit trails. Only those should be taken up. Next, prioritize capital deficit projects. Those projects which require a lot of investments but they are not getting it duly, for example the wind power projects. So they should be prioritized by the government. And now guys, what is imported inflation? Everybody has heard about inflation. The context is that ADB has put up alarm that India has to be guarded against inflation, and India, because the rupee could depreciate because there is rising interest rate in the West. And as a result of this, we might start importing inflation. Inflation we already have of our own. Now we might also import it from outside. So then what is imported inflation? First of all, what is inflation? Inflation is sustained rise in the general levels of prices of goods and services in any economy. When this inflation is coming from my own country, because there is certain cost push inflation, demand pull inflation is happening. Now, what is a cost push and demand pull? To explain it very, very clearly, let's say this is general price level of onions, okay? Because of some reason, the overall production in my economy with regards to onion, that came down. As a result of this, the supply shortage happened. The moment supply shortage happened, it became costly, or rather the input cost increased because maybe the crops failed or maybe in the warehouses they got spoiled. So this is known as cost push inflation. But what if suddenly everybody has got a lot of money? Everybody has got a lot of money, which means the purchasing power capacity has increased. So everybody is demanding even if the general price was of 90 rupees per kg, now people are demanding, because there is limited amount of commodity, people are demanding, I'll give you 100 rupees. Somebody is saying, I'll give you 120 rupees. As a result, it will get inflated because of heavy demand. So these are two kinds of inflation in the economy. Now, a variant of cost push is the imported inflation. Of course, this is a kind of inflation which is getting in a particular country because of the rise of the imported product's price. Which means, let's say I'm about to import gold or oil from Russia. And I know that Russia-Ukraine war is going on. There are certain supply challenges. There is certain sanctions on them, importing from them. So therefore, because of the fall or because of the rising prices of such commodities, when I'll be purchasing them for myself, I might purchase them at a higher level price, which means I'm importing this. Things are becoming costlier for me to import. This is importing inflation into my economy. So this is known as imported inflation. Why is it a variant of cost push inflation? Cost push inflation essentially means it's something which is causing shortages in the supply. So shortages in the supply sure can happen because let's say there is Russia-Ukraine war going on. So there is shortage of oil. Because shortage of oil is there, the prices are going up, and as a result of this, the overall final product price is also high. The petroleum product that I will be created, the refined petroleum product I'll be creating, that will also be costly. So this will go down deep into my economy by inflating prices of all the intermediary and final products. Correct? This is known as imported inflation. It's a part of cost push inflation. I hope you've understood this. Now, what are the causes? There are two primary causes. See, I want to purchase the oil and oil is there for me. If a balance is there, I will be striking the general price level and this won't amount to inflation. But inflation will happen once the price of this imported commodity will start rising, and this especially happens with gold and oil, which India heavily imports. India is heavily import dependent on them. So the key culprits are crude oil and critical minerals and as well your gold. Then the second one is different parts of them. The demand pull or the cost push. So demand pull can happen once the price of this oil has increased because I want to have recovery in my economy post-COVID. For that, I need to have a lot of industries functioning. I need to set up multiple power plants. So I might require oil more as compared to previous times. This will inflate the demand of the oil. This will inflate the prices of it. This is demand pull, imported inflation. What about the cost push? Let's say again, Ukraine-Russia war is going on. So the Black Sea route will be jolted. And as a result, I will be facing supply shortages. I will not be able to get it. And therefore, even if the demand is high, availability is very, very low. Due to low availability, I will incur cost push inflation, cost push imported inflation. But this is a dynamic played by the oil. But what about the hand which is about to purchase the oil? What if this hand weakens? This hand weakens because the purchasing capacity weakens. Maybe because my rupee is getting depreciated. Now, why my rupee will get depreciated? That is going to happen probably because I'm ridden with inflation in my country. That is happening probably because a lot of investors are going away from my country. Or this is happening because maybe I'm importing a lot of inflation. I'm trying to import a lot of things which is increasing my current account deficit. So in this manner, I will probably depreciate the currency. In this particular case, in this scenario, the ADB which is flagged, it has said that we are getting this imported inflation because of the rising interest prices. So obviously, the dollar will get boosted up and the rupee will get depreciated. What are the impacts? Let's quickly understand this. First of all, if my rupee is depreciated, my purchasing power capacity will deplete. It will reduce the purchasing power capacity of the country, which means, let's say I want to import something from another country. Will I be able to do that? No. So it will have a fallback on the importer. So importers, this is written incorrectly, importers will be the losers. It might also lead to a rise in the import bill because whatever I'm importing is getting very, very costly, which means current account deficit will also enhance, for which I need to have more forex reserves to deal with it. Next is, this will cause currency depreciation because in order to deal with this, I'm putting up more forex reserves into setting up this balance, managing this balance. So probably this can happen that my currency will also get depreciated. Then It will also cause end of easy monetary policy. If the economy is fine, government will allow loans to be accessed in very, very easy interest rate. But if government understand that inflation is going on, then government will try to have more hawkish policy. They will try to have more tighter money policy. They'll try to squeeze out the money. Loans will not be very easily available. If loans are not available, what will happen? Industries will not get capital. They will not get capital, which means that reduced investment leads to reduced infrastructure, leads to reduced employment generating venues, which also means that there will also rise in unemployment. So these are the overall impacts. You can also have a look into the losers and the winners and have assessment of your own. So this is about the analysis of what causes the imported inflation and what are the multiple figures and what are the multiple impacts of it. Now can we quickly jump into the prelim snippets? So these are the 4 things that we are going to read. First one is very important for upcoming prelims exam, I feel. So what is happening that a lot of, this is Gulf of Suez, and we know that a lot of Red Sea militancy is going on right now. Suez Canal is the closest route to move from Asia to Europe, connect Asia from Europe. And Suez Canal has been hijacked more often than not. So Israel specifically, and also there is dominancy of, because this is lying where? In the Sinai Peninsula, which is a part of Egypt. So in order to abate or counter the supremacy of the Egypt on the Suez Canal, Israel is trying to create an alternative route. So if you talk about Red Sea, there are 2 sources, there are 2 gulfs which opens up. One is the Gulf of Suez, second is the Gulf of Aqaba. Okay. So when the Gulf of Aqaba opens up, it opens up to Israel. Eilat over here, Eilat port is the only port which connects or gives the access of Israel towards Gulf of Aqaba and eventually to the Red Sea. Now from here onwards, it's trying to create an alternative canal, which is the Ben Gurion Canal. It is named after the founder of Israel. Okay, so Ben Gurion Canal is an alternative maritime route bypassing Suez Canal. It connects Gulf of Aqaba with the Mediterranean Sea, Red Sea, and then Mediterranean Sea as well, as you can see here. And it is going to benefit what? As you can see that this is lying here, this is Egypt and this is Israel. In the Israel, this green colored part is known as the Negev desert. So it is going to flow across this, built across this Negev desert. So please remember the name of this desert as well. It is going to benefit the border countries, of course. Border country is Egypt, border country is Jordan, border country is Israel, border country is also the Saudi Arabia, right? So it's going to benefit all of them by helping them create a maritime route which is making them bypass the Suez Canal in order to access the Mediterranean Sea. Now a question was asked, what is Levant? So Levant is nothing but any area which is situated to this Middle East area which is situated to the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. This question came. And this area is particularly comprising of the most conflicted areas of the world, your Cyprus, your Syria, your Israel, your Lebanon, etc. Okay, so this is Lebanon. Now the next topic is, can fishes use tool? You may wonder, why have I put this topic for you? The answer is prelims PYQ question of 2022, which asked which one of the following, I think 2023, which one of the following makes tool with a stick to scrape insect and make a hole in tree or a log of wood? So some animal which is able to make tool, but there are certain animals which are able to use the tools. Of course, they need to have hands or they need to have at least tentacles to do that. Fishes have got none. So this is a very surprising thing which is coming out, that 3 fishes in the Laccadive Sea, they have been found to be able to use the tools. The tools they are using is actually the dead and the living corals, which they are using to scrape off the hard shells of the sea urchins in order to consume the edible part of their bodies. These three fishes can be named because in the segment of species in news. So Jansen's wrasse, checkerboard wrasse, and moon wrasse are the following fishes. What are the other examples of some other animals which are able to use the tool? Mind you, they are not making the tool. These are chimpanzees. Well, chimpanzees can also somewhere make the tools. Then crows. Crows are also said to create some fashion leaves in order to extract insects from the crevices. So this is a very interesting topic. Talking about the tea plantation in India, a very important topic for this year prelims. Now listen me out. Tea plantation happened in many states. But one thing that you have to remember, there should be high level of humidity. and high level of precipitation in that particular area. That is a key segment of identifying whether it will be having tea plantation or not. The second thing is it should be having slope. The problem with tea plantation is that the crop will get rotten if it starts upholding the water, unlike rice. So it needs slope because it needs gradual movement of the water downhills. So growth conditions required is normally high temperature, moderate to high temperature. It requires very high humidity. It should not be less than 40%, which means it cannot be grown in areas like in the Malwa Plateau, in Rajasthan and Gujarat, not possible. Even in the Telangana Plateau, it's not possible. Then they require good drainage, which means they require a slopey terrain. That is also important. Another very important thing, they require acidic soils of about pH 5. So these are the growth conditions. According to these growth conditions, where can they be grown? Of course, you know about Kerala, you know about Assam, you know about Tripura, you know about West Bengal, Karnataka, etc. But if you go to the NCERT books, they have not mentioned states like Himachal, Uttarakhand, Bihar and Orissa. And in the previous year question, UPSC has asked that how many of the above generally known as tea producing states. Many of you must have over-analyzed it, that it is present in Kerala and it is present in Tripura, but then what about Himachal and Andhra? We've never heard of it. So it is present over there as well. The answer is all of the above. So kindly ensure that you know that where is Eastern Ghat, Western Ghat, where a slopey terrain, precipitation should be there. That will help you. Then what is the largest producer and exporter? It's not India, it's China. Both of them is China. India is in the second number. Then which body regulates the tea plantation in India? It's a statutory body named as Tea Boards, established in 1935 under the Ministry of Commerce. So I hope this basic is clear. Now talking about a very important organization known as Bretton Woods sister, which came along with World Bank in the year 1945 from the Bretton Woods Conference. This is IMF. This is again a sister of World Bank. Okay. But what are the particular objectives? See, objectives is very important to understand their alliances, to understand their projects, to understand their reports. Objective is to promote economic growth, ensuring financial stability, encouraging trade and reducing poverty. World Bank is more for development and removal of poverty. So when you've understood these objectives, can we very easily guess the name of the reports? There are only 3 reports. World Economic Outlook. Then this is not by World Economic Forum, which can be a confusing option. Then Global Financial Stability Report, because it actually looks for the financial stability. Then the Fiscal Monitor, because it monitors the economic growth as well. A question was asked in the UPSC 2014, World Economic Outlook published by whom? Not World Economic Forum, not World Bank, not UNDP, it is International Monetary Fund. So this was all about today's discussion. On that note, I wish and pray that you be the most hardest working and the most focused person you know around you. So on that note, I'll take your leave. Bye-bye. Take care.